She laughed when she said it. You always come around when he's gone. But something in her eyes made my heart forget to breathe. It started with a simple visit, the kind that didn't mean anything at first. I hadn't planned to see her. I was just dropping by my friend's house, like I'd done 100 times before. But when the door opened, it wasn't him standing there. It was his mother. She looked surprised for only a second before her expression softened into a knowing smile. Her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands falling freely around her face, and there was a quiet calm about her, like the kind of peace that only comes from someone who doesn't need to say much to be understood. The faint scent of vanilla and rain drifted from her sweater as she leaned on the doorframe. "Oh, it's you," she said lightly, her tone playful. "He's not home. You always come around when he's gone." I laughed it off, but her words stuck, not because of what she said, but how she said it. There was warmth in it, teasing maybe, but also an odd kind of attention that made me feel seen. She invited me in anyway. The living room hadn't changed, same framed family photos, same scent of fresh coffee and something floral. Yet being there with only her somehow made everything feel different. She moved around the kitchen with an effortless grace, filling the kettle, pulling 2 mugs from the shelf. I sat at the table, pretending not to notice the way her voice softened when she spoke, or how her laughter lingered just a little longer when I said something funny. We talked about simple things, her garden, my work, the strange quietness of the neighborhood lately. She asked if I'd been keeping busy, and when I admitted that I wasn't, she smiled knowingly. "You're still figuring it out," she said. "And that's okay. Most people never do." Something about the way she said that, without judgment, just quiet understanding, made me feel lighter. Like she saw me not as a boy who used to hang around her house, but as someone with his own story now. The conversation drifted easily. Sometimes we'd fall into silence, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt comfortable. The kind of silence that only happens when 2 people don't feel the need to fill every second with words. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door. The rain had stopped, and the faint glow of sunset spilled through the window behind her. She folded her arms loosely, that same teasing smile returning. "Next time," she said softly, "maybe you're just coming to see me." It was meant as a joke, I think. But the moment she said it, something in her tone, that mix of amusement and sincerity, stayed with me long after I walked away. I told myself it was nothing. Just friendly conversation. Just warmth and nostalgia. But that night, lying in bed, I could still feel the faint warmth of her hand when she passed me the mug, and the sound of her laughter echoed in my chest longer than I wanted to admit. A few days passed before I saw her again. It started with a message, short, simple, and entirely unexpected. "Hey, could you help me move a few boxes in the garden? They're too heavy for me." I remember staring at the text a bit longer than I should have. She didn't owe me anything, and she definitely didn't need to ask me for help. Still, before I could overthink it, I replied that I'd be there in 10 minutes. When I arrived, the late afternoon sun was stretching long shadows across the yard. She was already outside, kneeling near a patch of lavender, her hair pulled up in a loose bun. A few wisps had fallen free, glowing like strands of gold in the light. She looked peaceful, unhurried. She turned when she heard me and smiled. "You're fast," she teased, brushing a bit of dirt from her cheek. I was expecting at least one excuse. "I didn't want to miss your famous box-moving event," I said, pretending to stretch my shoulders like an athlete warming up. She laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that made her eyes crease at the corners. "Flattery and bad jokes," she said. "You're definitely your mother's son." We worked side by side, moving boxes from the garden shed to the porch. The boxes weren't that heavy, but I didn't mind pretending they were. It gave me an excuse to stay longer, to listen to her talk. She spoke about small things, the plants she was trying to keep alive, her recent obsession with watercolor painting, how the house felt too quiet lately. Every so often, our hands brushed, quick, unintentional touches that felt strangely significant. Once, when we both reached for the same box handle, Our fingers lingered there for just a second too long. It was a small moment, barely anything at all, but it felt like the world paused around it. Her eyes met mine, and I could swear I saw something flicker there: hesitation, curiosity, maybe even something she wasn't ready to name. She broke the moment first, her voice softer than before. "You're troubled, you know that?" I smiled faintly. "Why's that?" "Because you make it hard to remember how quiet things are supposed to be around here." The words caught me off guard. She said them lightly, but there was an honesty buried in them that made my chest tighten. We went back to work, pretending nothing had changed, but it had. The silence between us was heavier now, not uncomfortable, just charged. Every laugh, every shared glance carried more weight. When we finally finished, she handed me a glass of cold lemonade. Our fingers brushed again, and neither of us moved right away. The sun was setting behind her, outlining her in soft gold. She smiled, that same teasing smile from before, but this time it felt different. "Thanks for helping," she said. "I might have to keep finding excuses to call you over." And maybe it was the way she said it, or the look in her eyes as she did, but for the first time, I realized she didn't mean it as a joke. The rain started earlier than the forecast had promised. I remember the sky shifting, soft gray clouds drifting low, the kind that make everything feel slower, quieter, somehow closer. I had gone over to return her gardening gloves she'd left in my car. I could have waited until the weather cleared, but I didn't. When she opened the door, she laughed softly. "You really don't check the weather, do you?" Rain misted her hair, tiny drops glinting against loose strands that framed her face. I handed her the gloves with a grin. "Didn't want you to think I stole them." She shook her head, smiling. "Come in before you catch something." The house smelled like cinnamon and rain, warm, comforting. She had a record playing somewhere in the background, an old jazz tune that filled the quiet spaces like conversation could. She made tea while I stood near the window, watching the rain trace thin, clear lines down the glass. When she sat across from me at the small kitchen table, she looked thoughtful, distant almost. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. "Days like this," she said after a pause, "used to be my favorite." "Used to be?" I asked. She smiled faintly, tracing the rim of her cup with a finger. "They're quieter now. The house feels bigger when it rains." I understood what she meant, that kind of quiet that isn't peaceful anymore, just empty. Her son had moved out for college a few months ago. She joked about it before, how the silence took time to get used to. But now, her voice carried something softer. Loneliness wrapped in grace. "I guess I like the quiet," I said, trying to meet her halfway. "But not when it's this kind." Her eyes lifted to mine. There was a shared recognition in that glance. Two people, both trying to fill spaces they didn't know they had. For a while, we didn't say anything. The only sound was rain against the glass and the steady clink of her teaspoon as she stirred. Then, as if without thinking, she reached across the table, her hand brushing lightly over mine. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." Her hand was warm, soft, steady, grounding. The touch was brief, but it lingered long enough to change something. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something deeper than that, something real, quiet, human. When I finally stood to leave, the rain had softened to a drizzle. She walked me to the door, her cardigan drawn loosely around her shoulders. "It's nice," she said softly, almost to herself. "Having someone who actually listens." I nodded, not trusting my voice. As I stepped out into the rain, I looked back once. She was still standing there, hand resting on the doorframe, watching me go. And for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to come back. It was supposed to be a quick visit, just long enough to return a book she'd lent me weeks ago. A novel about love, loss, and second chances. The kind of story that had felt too far from my own life at the time, though, lately, it didn't feel so distant anymore. When she opened the door, she looked pleasantly surprised. "You finished it already?" "Couldn't stop reading," I said. "You have good taste." She smiled. You sound surprised. There was a teasing light in her eyes that made me forget the chill in the evening air. She stood aside, motioning for me to come in, and before I knew it, I was sitting at her kitchen table again, the same one where we'd shared tea during that rainy afternoon. She was cooking, nothing fancy, just pasta and garlic bread, the air rich with the scent of butter and herbs. The sound of sizzling in the pan filled the room, blending with the faint hum of the radio. I offered to help, but she waved me off. You'll just make a mess, she said, glancing over her shoulder. Maybe I'm better company than a cook, I replied. She laughed, that warm, unguarded sound that always seemed to fill more space than it should. For a moment, I just watched her move around the kitchen, calm, confident, graceful in ways she didn't even seem aware of. The light caught the faint silver in her hair, and I thought it looked beautiful. Dinner wasn't planned, but it felt natural. We ate at the small table, talking about everything and nothing, books, movies, the places she wanted to visit someday but never had time for. Every now and then, her hand would brush mine as we reached for the same dish, and every time it happened, the air seemed to grow warmer. When she laughed too hard at one of my stories, she reached out, touching my forearm as if to steady herself. It was such a small gesture, innocent, fleeting, but it sent a quiet rush through me. Her fingers lingered just a second longer than they needed to. You're good company, she said softly, almost to herself. The words shouldn't have meant as much as they did. But in the glow of the kitchen light, with her voice barely above a whisper, they felt intimate, like something only meant for that moment. After dinner, I helped her with the dishes despite her half-hearted protests. The clink of glasses, the rush of warm water, the faint scent of rosemary soap, it all blurred into something simple, peaceful, unspoken. At one point, her sleeve brushed against my wrist. She looked up, eyes meeting mine for a heartbeat too long. Neither of us said a word. When the dishes were done, I thanked her and started to leave. But as I reached the doorway, she said quietly, You don't always have to wait for an excuse to stop by. I turned back, smiling. Maybe next time I'll just come for dinner. She smiled too, that soft, knowing smile that said she wouldn't mind. And just like that, something between us shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but gently, like the first ripple on still water. It happened on a Sunday evening, one of those quiet days that stretches longer than it should. I had dropped by to help her fix a loose shelf in the living room. It wasn't anything urgent, but she'd mentioned it casually earlier in the week, and I'd offered without thinking twice. The house felt familiar now, the scent of her vanilla candles, the soft hum of music always playing somewhere in the background. She was in the kitchen making tea while I adjusted the screws, pretending to focus, but my mind wasn't on the shelf. It was on her. On the way her voice softened when she spoke to me now. On how natural it felt being here. When I finished, I stood back to check my work. That's when I noticed it, a small framed photo on the edge of the shelf. It was from years ago, me, her son, and her, standing together at a barbecue in their backyard. I was barely 19 then, smiling too wide, awkward in the way young men are. She was next to us, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. I remember the moment the photo was taken, how she'd laughed when I dropped the lemonade bottle, how her hand had steadied me just like that. I picked it up without really thinking. The glass was slightly smudged, the colors faded. But looking at it now, I felt something strange, like I was seeing it for the first time. She walked in, holding 2 cups of tea, and caught me staring. That's an old one, she said, smiling softly. You both looked like such kids. I nodded, still looking at it. You haven't changed much. She laughed quietly, setting the cups down. That's kind of you, but the mirror says otherwise. I turned to her then, and for a second, the words just slipped out. I don't mean how you look. I mean, how you make people feel. You still have that same warmth. The room went still. The kind of silence that says everything words can't. She looked at me, eyes soft but uncertain. You shouldn't say things like that, she said finally. Her voice wasn't sharp. If anything, it trembled just slightly, as though she didn't fully mean the warning. I smiled faintly, setting the photo back down. Maybe I shouldn't. But it's true. She stood there for a moment, then sat down slowly, her hands wrapping around her tea mug. You're kind, she whispered. And young. You don't always see the lines the world draws for you. I wanted to tell her that I did see them, that I saw her not as my friend's mother, not as someone older, but as someone who understood me in a way no one else had. But I didn't. Because I could tell she already knew. The rain outside had started again, faint against the windows. She looked away, but her expression wasn't distant. It was full of thought, full of quiet feelings she couldn't put into words. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat in that soft, complicated silence, both pretending to watch the rain. But in that stillness, I realized something. I was already too far gone. And judging by the way her fingers trembled slightly when she lifted her cup, maybe, so was she. After that night with the photograph, things changed, not outwardly, but in all the quiet ways that matter. Her messages became shorter, less frequent. A few polite replies. A few polite excuses. I've been busy. Next week, maybe. I understood what she was doing, creating space before the lines blurred any further. And I told myself I should respect that. I should let her breathe, give her the distance she clearly needed. But what I didn't expect was how empty the days felt without her voice, her calm presence, her laughter echoing faintly in my head. I still passed by her streets sometimes on my walks, half hoping, half dreading to see her car in the driveway. It wasn't obsession, it was something quieter, gentler, but no less consuming. Like missing a warmth you didn't realize you'd grown used to. Weeks passed. The air had turned cooler, autumn leaves were gathering along the curb. One evening, I found myself walking past her house again. The porch light was on, soft amber spilling across the front steps. The curtains glowed faintly from inside. I hesitated, then laughed under my breath. What was I doing? Before I could turn away, the door opened. She stood there, sweater draped loosely around her shoulders, eyes widening in surprise before softening into something else. I thought I saw you, she said quietly. You walk like you're thinking too hard. I smiled, a little embarrassed. Guilty. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two people unsure whether to close the space or hold it. Then she stepped aside. Come in. You look cold. The warmth of the house hit me immediately, the faint smell of cinnamon, the quiet hum of the heater. Everything looked the same, yet it felt different now, heavier with everything unsaid. We sat in the living room, a small lamp casting a gentle light between us. She broke the silence first. I've been avoiding you, she said simply. And I hate that I have. Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, a small, unguarded tell. I didn't want to, she continued. But after that night, I didn't know what to do. I didn't trust myself not to cross a line I promised I wouldn't. I nodded slowly. And did the distance help? She looked at me then, a long, searching look that said everything her words couldn't. No, she whispered. It made it worse. Something in my chest eased, not joy exactly, but understanding. I reached for her hand, hesitating just enough to give her time to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers were warm, trembling slightly. The room went still, the air thick with everything neither of us had dared to say aloud. She took a quiet breath. I miss this, she said. Missed you. Even when I tried not to. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore, it was full. When I finally left that night, the air outside was cold, but I didn't feel it. I could still feel her hand in mine, her voice echoing softly in my head. I miss you. And for the first time, I knew we had crossed the invisible line, not with touch, but with truth. Time softened everything. Not the feelings, those stayed, but the sharp edges around them. What had once felt impossible began to settle into something quiet, steady, and real. We didn't rush back into each other's lives, we just found our way naturally. A message here, a coffee there. Some evenings spent talking on the porch when the air was cool and the sky turned gold. There were no confessions, no declarations, just a slow rebuilding of what distance had tried to erase. One Saturday morning, she texted me, "If you're not busy, I could use help with the garden again." The same words as before. I smiled, remembering the sunlight, the laughter, the first time our hands had brushed over a box. But this time felt different. Lighter. Easier. When I arrived, she was already outside, kneeling by the flower bed. The late afternoon sun shimmered through the leaves, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to hide anymore. "Thought I'd lost my favorite helper," she said. "You almost did," I replied softly. We spent hours together, talking about nothing and everything. She told me about the art classes she'd started teaching again, about how she'd begun painting sunsets instead of still life. "Because they never look the same twice," she said. I told her about a new job I'd started, how busy things had gotten, but how some part of me always drifted back here. She listened the way she always did, with her whole attention, her eyes steady and kind. At one point she paused to wipe dirt from her hands, then looked at me and said, "Do you ever think about how strange this is? How something small just changes everything?" "Every day," I said honestly. The air between us felt peaceful now, no longer charged with uncertainty, just full of quiet understanding. We didn't need to define what we were. We didn't need to name it. The connection spoke for itself, gentle, familiar, and true. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in soft gold, we sat on the porch steps. She leaned against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. The weight was comforting, a simple, human closeness that didn't ask for more than it gave. Neither of us spoke for a while. The cicadas hummed, the air grew cooler, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like the whole world had slowed down just for us. Finally, she said quietly, "You really do come around at the right times." I smiled, turning my head slightly toward her. "Maybe it's because you're the reason I do." She let out a small laugh, that same soft, melodic sound that had first pulled me in. Then she closed her eyes, and for a long while, we just sat there, two people who had crossed so many unspoken boundaries only to find peace on the other side. It wasn't a grand ending. There was no dramatic kiss, no sweeping music. Just stillness. Understanding. Something like love. And somehow, that felt more real than anything else ever could.